Hello, and welcome. Today we journey back in time, to the ancient land of Israel, to the story of a woman whose silent prayer changed history. Imagine carrying a burden so heavy, yet having no words to express it, a heart so broken that only a whisper could escape your lips. This is the story of Hannah, a woman mocked, misunderstood, but ultimately heard by God. In the hills of ancient Israel lived a woman named Hannah. She was the beloved wife of Elkanah. Yet despite his love, her heart ached with sorrow, because Hannah had no children. She lived in a time when a woman's worth was often tied to her ability to bear children. Though her husband Elkanah loved her deeply, his love could not erase the ache in her heart. Hannah was barren. Year after year, she watched other women cradle their babies, while she carried a silent grief, a sorrow that seemed endless. And to make it worse, Peninnah, her husband's other wife, had many children. But instead of offering kindness, Peninnah mocked her, reminding her again and again of what she lacked. Each word, each sneer cut deeper, making Hannah feel even more inadequate, more broken. The Bible tells us that Peninnah provoked Hannah severely, taunting her because the Lord had closed her womb. 1 Samuel 1:6. Imagine the weight of that, being reminded day after day of what you lacked, of what your heart desperately longed for, and not just by anyone, but by someone who seemed to delight in your pain. Worse still, being told that God himself had withheld it from you. How do you keep believing in a God who has the power to change your situation, but doesn't seem to? How do you hold on to faith when your prayers seem to go unanswered? Every year, Hannah traveled with her family to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord. But even in worship, there was no relief. Her sorrow clung to her, unshaken, unrelenting. Then came a year when the pain became too much to bear. She couldn't even eat. Elkanah, her husband, though well-meaning, didn't fully understand. "Why do you weep? Why don't you eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" 1 Samuel 1:8. His love for her was real, but it couldn't fill the void. He couldn't grasp the depth of her longing, the weight of her sorrow. And so, in deep distress, Hannah went to the temple to pray. But this was not just any prayer. This was a prayer from the depths of her soul, a cry so raw, so desperate that words alone could not contain it. She wept bitterly, her silent lips moving as she poured out her heart before God. And in that moment of surrender, she made a vow. 1 Samuel 1:10-11. "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, if you will not forget your servant but give me a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever touch his head." Hannah wasn't just asking for a child. She was surrendering that child before he even existed. This was not a selfish prayer. Yes, it was a prayer of desperation, but even more, it was a prayer of deep faith. She was saying, "God, if you bless me, I will give the blessing back to you." But even as she prayed, even in her most vulnerable moment, she was misunderstood. Eli, the priest, watched her lips move, but heard no sound. He didn't see a woman pouring out her soul before God. He saw someone who, to him, appeared drunk. He rebuked her, saying, "How long will you be drunk? Put away your wine." Imagine that. She had come to the one place where she thought she could find relief. But instead of comfort, she was accused. But Hannah, instead of taking offense, responded with humility. With a voice filled with sorrow yet unwavering faith, she said, "No, my Lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord." She didn't defend herself with anger. She didn't lash out in frustration. She simply spoke the truth, with grace and humility. "Not so, my Lord," Hannah replied, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief. 1 Samuel 1:15-16. A moment of silence passed. Eli, realizing his mistake, softened. He looked at her and said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." 1 Samuel 1:17. Something shifted in that moment. Hannah had no proof that her prayer would be answered, no visible sign that things would change. And yet, the Bible says, she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. 1 Samuel 1:18. That's what real faith looks like, trusting God enough to leave the burden at his feet, even before the answer comes. And then, in the course of time, God remembered Hannah. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah made love to his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." 1 Samuel 1:19-20. The very thing she had been denied, the very thing she had wept for, was now placed in her arms. But now came the real test. Would she keep her vow? Would she surrender the very thing she had longed for? After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. She said to him, "Pardon me, my Lord. As surely as you live, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." 1 Samuel 1:24-28. Hannah did not hesitate. She didn't cling to Samuel in fear. She didn't hold back what she had promised. She gave him back to God, knowing that he was never truly hers to begin with, and instead of weeping, instead of mourning the sacrifice, she worshipped. She lifted her voice in a song of praise. Then Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God." 1 Samuel 2:1-2. Her pain had turned into praise. Her sorrow had become her testimony, and God was not done blessing her. Because of her faithfulness, he gave her more children. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home, and the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. 1 Samuel 2:20-21. Hannah's greatest sorrow became her greatest testimony. Her deepest pain led to her greatest purpose, and through her obedience, Samuel, her son, became one of the greatest prophets of Israel, because when we surrender what we love most to God, he does far more with it than we ever could. Hannah's story teaches us that God's delays are not denials, that faith requires surrender, and that when we give our desires back to God, he turns them into something greater than we could ever dream. If you are in a waiting season today, if you feel like God has forgotten you, remember Hannah. Keep praying, keep believing, keep trusting, because in due time, God will remember you too. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.